Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. The webinar is called Proxy Voting Power, How Asset Owners Can Activate Their Shares and Make Meaningful Change This Spring. So the first thing I would like to do is to acknowledge that we are broadcasting this event on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. My name is Hugues Letourneau. I am program manager at Share, and I also run co-run the emerging network called the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this first event that we are organizing since officially launching the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network at the Share Investor Summit back in February, in what feels like a very long time ago. The CCSN was indeed launched this past February, and it is a network of labor-nominated trustees on pension fund boards and trade union representatives across Canada who are committed to making meaningful changes in capital markets through the effective stewardship of workers' capital. So a few words about this webinar. As many of you know, the 2020 proxy season is starting. Many companies will be organizing and holding AGMs in the next few weeks, and many of those AGMs will be virtual this year as a result of the coronavirus and the global pandemic. During the Investor Summit, some session participants brought to our attention that it would be valuable for them to have a deep dive into proxy voting. And as a result of this, we are organizing this webinar today. So over the next 60 minutes, we will be unpacking the following items. Firstly, we will talk about why it is important for asset owners to monitor how proxies are voted. Secondly, how can proxy voting drive meaningful change at the company level and ultimately for workers? And thirdly, what are some key resolutions that you should be looking at in this upcoming AGM season that relate to workers' rights and trade union priorities? I'm very happy that we have three dynamic speakers today on the webinar. You're first going to hear from Shannon Rohan, the Chief Strategy Officer at Share. Secondly, from Colette Murphy, the Executive Director of the Atkinson Foundation. And third but not least, Emma Pullman, who is Capital Stewardship Officer at the BC Government Employees Union. So just a few housekeeping items before we roll right into the presentations. We are keen to make this an interactive experience in which you can speak up and ask questions through the chat box, which should be located in the lower part of the GoToWebinar portal. So we encourage you to send questions to us by writing at any point during the webinar. After the speaker presentations, we will have a period of Q&As and a period of discussion. Another option will be to directly ask your questions. In order to do that, you have to click on the hand icon and we will activate your microphone and you will be able to ask your questions out loud. And finally, please note that we are recording this webinar and that it will be made available on the CCSN website. So without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker today, so Shannon Rohan. And over the next few minutes, she will speak about how asset owners can activate stewardship through proxy voting, why oversight by trustees is integral to fiduciary duty, and what are some tools for effective oversight. So I'll turn it over to you, Shannon.
Great, thank you so much, Hugues. It's great to be here with everyone this morning, if not virtually, and I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their days to attend and talk about something that we're quite excited about here at Share. As you all know, this is really the ramp up of proxy voting season, and we certainly know that from our colleagues here at the Share office who are voting proxies all around the world on behalf of our clients. I just want to get the presentation set up here. So I will just get Tamara. There we go. So what I want to talk about today is, first of all, starting sort of at the foundation, what is proxy voting? How are proxies normally voted on behalf of your funds? I want to also talk about why proxy voting is important and why this is such a significant and critical part of our role as shareholders in terms of capital stewardship. And finally, I want to sort of walk through some key steps that trustees can take to really make sure that they're overseeing their proxy voting in an effective way and really making sure that those votes are being cast on their behalf in a way that meets their expectations and their beliefs. So starting from sort of ground zero, what is proxy voting? As all of you know, most common stock carries the right to vote at shareholder meetings. So if you are a shareholder in a company, you do have the right to vote at annual and other special shareholder meetings. Shareholders can attend and vote in person at these meetings, but the most common way that proxies or that voting is done is by proxy. And so investment managers or a voting service provider may be delegated to vote on a shareholder's behalf. The kinds of things that we're voting on at these meetings tend to be things like election of directors, appointment of auditors. An emerging piece that we're voting on at most companies is around an advisory vote on executive compensation, otherwise known as say on pay. The other issues that we vote on are not only those that management put on the agenda, but also issues that shareholders are putting on the agenda. And those relate commonly to things like human rights, Indigenous rights, decent work, and climate change. And so many of us, including those of us here on the call, share through our investor network, the Atkinson Foundation, which is part of our network, and GEU, which is leading its own capital stewardship work, which is fabulous, are also actively putting things on the agenda at companies, and we're asking shareholders to cast their votes and make their opinions known. And so we'll hear more about those efforts by Atkinson and the BCGEU in a few moments. So if we just go to the next slide, I want to just take a look at how proxies are most commonly voted. So if Tamara can just switch that slide, that would be great. So there are several ways that pension funds and other asset owners will have a system for their proxy voting. The most common is to delegate to your investment manager. And so that is often that your managers are actually casting those votes on your behalf. They may or may not be reporting to you regularly on how those votes are being cast. If they're not, make sure that they are, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Some pension funds and other asset owners that are probably slightly bigger will hire a third-party proxy voting service provider. And so you may have heard of organizations such as ISS or Glass Lewis, and Share, for that matter, has our own proxy execution service, and we do vote proxies on behalf of a group of pension funds and foundations and religious investors, and Atkinson Foundation is also a part of that. Some funds may do their voting in-house, so they may have that expertise or capacity to be voting in-house, but that is not very common to be able to have that capacity internally. And I just want to draw everyone's attention to the difference between pooled funds and segregated funds. So in a segregated fund, as you know, you own the underlying shares of companies, and that gives you those proxy voting rights. In a pooled fund, however, you own units of the pool, and so you actually don't have the underlying voting rights. But I want to note that even though you don't actually aren't able to direct those underlying voting rights, it is still really important that you have oversight of how the pool is voting. And it's still really important that you're using your voice and asking the questions and understanding how decisions on the voting rights of the pool are being made, because that, it again, is a key aspect of how that pool is being stewarded. So those are the different ways that proxies are most commonly voted. As I said, delegating to your investment manager is the most common that we see, certainly in the Canadian marketplace. So if we can just go to the next slide. I really wanted to talk about why proxy voting is important, and I think there's primarily three fundamental reasons. The first is that, as I've said, voting rights are valuable assets for pension funds and other asset owners. Trustees, the second one is really coming down to fiduciary duty, and trustees have an obligation to ensure that the shares owned by the plan are voted in a way that supports the interests of the plan's participants over the long term. So the trustees of the fund and anyone that you're appointing or hiring to vote your proxies on the trustees' behalf do in fact have a duty of loyalty to exercise their proxy voting and authority with the prudence and skill and diligence that a prudent person would exercise in managing the property of others. So there is a fiduciary element to how your proxies are being voted, and I think that's really important for trustees and others in governance roles of these funds who are on the call to understand. And so failing to vote the plan shares, voting without consideration of the effects of the vote, or voting arbitrarily with or against management would really violate these duties. So it's really important that we have the system in place to be able to, that we're overseeing the way these proxies are being voted as part of our fiduciary duty. And finally, the third reason that proxy voting is really important is really that influence piece. Voting influences corporate behavior. By exercising your voting rights, shareholders are communicating with corporate boards and with corporate management about matters that affect company's governance, that affect their operations, and is really an opportunity to express your expectations with regards to the company's performance and its management. And I just wanted to sort of give this a bit more of a tangible example. And I had the opportunity yesterday to speak to our proxy voting manager here at Share, and she is very, very busy. Her name is Catherine Smith, so she's right getting into the thick of it in terms of voting. So I really appreciated that she took some time to just let me know of some of the votes she's been seeing and casting votes on behalf of our clients. And one of the ones that she brought to my attention was the advisory vote on executive compensation at Walt Disney Company. And so, as many of you likely know, sorry for this background noise, the executive compensation at US companies particularly it has a tendency to be quite exorbitant. So she was voting on the Walt Disney Company executive compensation package. As you know, shareholders across North America, and including Share here in Canada, fought quite hard to ensure that shareholders had the opportunity to vote either in favor or withhold their votes around executive compensation. We felt very strongly, along with many, many shareholders, that this was a key aspect of a company's management, and that shareholders had the right to express their views on executive compensation. So that is something that we fought very, very hard for in Canada and North America. And so as a result of those efforts, we now do have advisory votes on executive compensation at most companies in Canada. So the Walt Disney Company, and this is going back to this vote that Catherine was analyzing, Walt Disney Company paid its CEO 911 times the median employee wage. Sorry, I just like 911 times. That's like insane. It's huge. And Disney's top 5 executives were paid a total of $93 million US in 2019. And so this level of pay is happening at the same company where we have seen reports of frontline workers at Disney living in their cars, not being able to access healthcare because they don't have benefits, not being able to pay their rent because they don't earn a living wage. And so we have the very precarious situation of Disney workers on one hand, and $93 million pay packages for the company's 5 top executives. So interestingly enough, the vote results on that pay package, approximately 54% of shareholders supported the executive compensation package, and 46% voted against the package or abstained. So in the context of shareholder votes and results, 46% against is a very, very high vote result, and certainly will require the company to respond and reevaluate its executive compensation. But at the same time, over 50% of shareholders voted in favor of that, and said, basically telling the company that this is justified. And so I wanted to give you this example to illustrate why getting out, voting with intention, and your roles as trustees in overseeing voting is so important. So obviously Share voted against this particular package because we believe that this kind of disparity is just unacceptable. And so we'll actually vote against executive compensation purely on quant. Although we also analyze all sorts of aspects of executive compensation, but at a certain point when multiples get at that over 900, I mean, we're just voting against them. So if we can go to the next slide, Tamara, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to go through these quite quickly here. I wanted to talk about, okay, what are some of the key steps for trustees? What are some of the things that you can be doing to better understand how your proxies are being voted? And the first one, obviously, is just to learn how your fund's proxy ballots are being voted. Who does the voting? If it's your manager, do they use proxy voting guidelines? If so, do the guidelines align with your fund's beliefs? Do the guidelines have sufficient guidance around environmental and social considerations? So, for example, Share's guidelines talk about the compensation and pay ratio of CEOs and median pay. Our guidelines include reference to the ILO standards. So these are some of the things you want to look at. If your managers have guidelines, what do those guidelines look like? Do the managers buy research? So are they buying proxy voting research from ISS or Glass Lewis? These are the kinds of things you want to start to understand in terms of how your ballots are being voted. The second piece is really from the governance standpoint, making sure that your system of proxy voting is embedded in your investment policy. So you want to make sure that your statement of investment policies and procedures really does outline the roles and responsibilities around proxy voting, what your expectations are in terms of reporting. Do you want reporting from your proxy voting agent or your investment manager on a quarterly basis? Do you want that on an annual basis? Are there things, particular ways you want that reporting to come to you? And you also want to make sure that your investment policy gives you the discretion to direct votes on specific issues. So if you're in a segregated fund, you want to make sure you have the right to direct the vote, and that should be laid out in your investment policy. Some funds, again, if you're in a segregated fund, will actually look to develop their own proxy voting guidelines and ask their managers or their proxy service agents to vote according to those guidelines. And so we've seen several funds able to do that, work with their managers and have their votes cast with a custom set of guidelines. And so that's something that you might want to do to ensure that when issues are coming up on the ballot related to decent work, related to just transition, related to executive compensation, the guidelines give you some security that those are going to be cast in a way that align with your expectations and your beliefs. So the next slide will just go through 3 more steps that you can consider and think about. Oh, I think we skipped. There we go. Oh, yeah. So the fourth step, incorporate proxy voting into your asset manager hiring and monitoring and oversight. So it's really important for your managers to be reporting to you on how they're voting. Many funds will receive those kinds of reports on a quarterly basis, but as many of you might know, you might get those reports and they're, this thick and there's like thousands of votes. It's very hard to go through those and understand, what's the information that's valuable. So there are ways you can ask your manager to focus on certain things. What percentage of votes did they vote with management versus against management? You can also ask about things like executive comp. How many packages did they vote against? You can ask for specific information on votes around environmental and social issues, for example. So those are ways you can actually draw more valuable information from your managers. Just a story there, if you start, we've had situations where people have, started asking their managers about proxy voting, and there's often two different reactions. One is like, they're pleasantly surprised because they're actually putting a lot of resources into their analysis and doing that voting in a very diligent way. So they're really excited to be able to share that this isn't this piece of work that they're doing that's hidden to their clients. The other reaction that we've heard about is sort of like, why would you want to know that? Like, you don't need to worry about that, right? And so it's interesting to see how managers may react when you start asking for more information on the proxy voting, and just how they react might be a good signal of how that's being overseen. I think I spoke about this, evaluating your voting record. You can ask for data points that might help you. If you have multiple managers, how are their voting records comparing? And this is important if you own shares in two portfolios at the same company. Are you voting against yourself, or are you voting in a way that's aligned? And finally, I just want to say, be proactive and watch for upcoming votes of interest. So this is one of the roles of the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network, is to make sure that you're getting up-to-date information on things coming up on the ballots of Canadian and global companies. When you get those alerts, we often call them proxy alerts, you can take those, send it to your manager, or bring it forward at a meeting with your managers and ask, what is their vote intention, and share the analysis that's provided there. So that's a really good resource. And next slide, I just wanted to make you aware of some resources that we have at Share that may be useful. We do have model proxy voting guidelines. They're among the most extensive guidelines probably globally, particularly around emerging corporate governance issues and emerging environmental and social issues. So there's extensive guidelines there related to Indigenous rights, as I said, related to human and labor rights, and also related to climate change and just transition. We also work with funds and asset owners to help them develop their own customized proxy voting guidelines. So that's another resource that may be valuable to folks. As I mentioned, we do have a full voting service, and we have a group of funds from across Canada that have actually delegated their voting directly to Share. And we also do proxy vote monitoring and research. So you are also able to purchase research from Share and also be made aware through a more integrated alert system of proxies that are coming up in your portfolio that you want to pay attention to. And the final slide, I just wanted to, a new tool that we've just developed and has just been released is our proxy audit tool. And this is a tool that really does look back at how your proxy votes were executed in the past year or over the proxy voting season. And this will help you to understand how, take out from all of that data some key data points and metrics to help you understand and oversee how your proxies were executed. So we look at things like, if you have multiple managers, how did they vote? Looking at in cases where a high percentage of shareholders voted in favor of something, did you also vote in favor, or were you actually sort of a minority and voting against something where we're seeing a high percentage of other capital market players actually supporting that? It's a way to see how your managers are voting on things like executive compensation, climate-related pieces, as well as some of the votes that we're going to talk about here today around decent work and labor rights. So if you want more information on that, please get in touch with us. And I think that's it for me, and I will hand it back over to Hugues.
Thank you very much, Shannon. And just you touched on the CEO pay ratio and these outrageous ratios that we see in the US. Just in the interest of everyone on the webinar, there was a good column yesterday in the Globe and Mail that talks about CEO pay ratio in the Canadian context and in the current context of COVID-19, inequalities, and the value, I guess, of having workers and, you know, capital allocation. So thinking about executive compensation, the amounts that go to workers, and what goes to, of course, shareholders as well. So we're going to turn to our second speaker, so Colette Murphy. And Colette is the executive director of the Atkinson Foundation. And it's a foundation that strengthens movements for decent work and equitable economic developments. And in many ways, the Atkinson Foundation has been a pioneer in responsible investing in Canada. She will present on the case of a shareholder resolution at Restaurant Brands International that amplified investor voices in support of decent work. So over to you, Colette.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate this invitation from the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network to participate in this conversation. Thank you, Shannon, and the rest of the SHARE team for organizing it. And thanks to all of you for making it a priority today. What we have in common is a commitment to investing workers' capital in ways that uphold their rights and the interests of their families and their communities. I don't need to tell you why this mission is important, even more important in the midst of a pandemic than it was when this network was launched in February. You know that workers, their families, and all of our communities are experiencing unimaginable pressure. Our economy is in a medicatedly induced coma. At least that's what Irene Yelnesian calls it. She's an Atkinson economist and the Atkinson Fellow at the Future. She's an economist and the Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers. Everyone must ask themselves what power they have to help the planet move from an acute situation to one we can manage over time. Shareholders like you and me are in a position to keep workers at the center of the corporate calculus and to make sure that workers are not the biggest casualties of an economy in a terribly painful transition. As an investor, Atkinson is concerned with corporate transparency. We want to see how the companies in our portfolio treat workers. We also want to know how they perform relative to their competitors. In this way, our money is aligned with our philanthropic mission to challenge inequality by creating more decent work in a fair economy. As Hugues said, I've been asked to tell you about a shareholder action we took last year with Share's help. It was focused on the rights of Tim Hortons workers. Let me start with a short clip from an American late-night TV show from a couple of months ago. Tomorrow, could you pull that up, please?
Trudeau may have really gone too far.
Some donut drama for Justin Trudeau. The Only in Canada controversy started with the Prime Minister tweeting a photo of himself carrying boxes from the O Donuts shop in Winnipeg to help fuel a wintertime cabinet meeting. Some on social media praised Trudeau for supporting a local business. Others criticized him for buying about $200 worth of elitist donuts instead of hitting the local Tim Hortons at about a third of the price.
Really, Canada? That's your scandal? Your Prime Minister brought the wrong donuts? I love how some Canadians are upset because they say Trudeau didn't go to the local donut shop Tim Hortons. That's what they said. They said, why did you go to this elitist place instead of the local Tim Hortons? Okay, there's nothing local about Tim Hortons, all right? It's a giant corporation.
Comedic exaggeration aside, Trevor Noah shows us how the economy works and how it could work differently. It's true that Tim Hortons' parent company, Restaurant Brands International, or RBI as it's known, is majority owned by a Brazilian hedge fund, 3G Capital. But it's also true that many franchises are owned by Canadians, and many Canadians hold RBI stock, including the Atkinson Foundation. A year before Donut Gate scandal broke in Winnipeg, almost to the day, I put forward Atkinson's shareholder proposal at the RBI AGM. We asked the company to disclose how it creates work that is decent and dignifying across its 26,000 franchisees. We invited a staff member with the Workers' Action Center to come with us. WAC is a longtime partner of ours and a relentless decent work activist. They've been organizing alongside Tim Hortons workers for better workplace practices, such as paid work breaks, benefits, and an end to short-term shift scheduling. Now, you should know that this was the first time I had ever attended a corporate AGM, let alone spoke at one. You can usually find me engaging elected officials and public servants to advance workers' rights through the public policy development process. At Atkinson, we use our power as active citizens daily in countless ways, but have opted to give our proxy to chair instead of making proposals directly in the past. I didn't really expect to win the vote when we walked into the meeting that day, but I did expect to light a fire under the complacent executives. When the votes were tallied, 66% of independent shareholders voted in favor of our proposal. This outcome could not go unnoticed or dismissed. It was a clear sign that decent work matters to Canadians who own shares in companies, to Canadians who operate businesses, and to Canadians who are employed by them. As you might imagine, though, of course, RBI recommended shareholders vote against the proposal. The majority shareholder, 3G Capital, voted against us, resulting in an overall vote of 25.8%. This result sets the stage for our next proposal. Maybe I'll stop there and see if you have any questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Colette. So I think you've set the stage very well, and I think everyone would like to know what do you intend to do during this upcoming AGM season?
Okay, so here's really the remarkable thing. The company hasn't provided any of the information requested in the proposal, nor have they made a commitment to address these issues. It's unusual for a company to not respond to majority votes of independent shareholders. We don't know why they haven't responded. We can imagine that they simply don't know how to engage such a reasonable proposal. But what we do know for sure is that we're not going away, even if there's a preferred outcome, if that's their preferred outcome. We're ready to add fuel to the fire and to encourage more shareholders to give it oxygen. So Atkinson had a very different experience when we first filed our, last winter when we first filed our shareholder proposal. It was only a couple months earlier from that. Before going to the vote, the bank, RBC, signaled a willingness to respond directly to the workforce issues we had raised, so we withdrew the proposal. But with share support, Atkinson is taking two steps on the RBI file this spring. First, we have refiled the same proposal, asking RBI to disclose how it ensures minimum standards for decent work in its franchises. We're shooting for an even higher vote among independent shareholders. Second, we will recommend that shareholders withhold their votes for the chair of the Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee. This vote is an opportunity to send a clear signal that shareholders will not accept the board's failure to respond to shareholder concerns. I don't think there's any question RBI continues to feel intense heat these days from all sides, not only its shareholders. At the start of the COVID-19 lockdown, Tim Hortons was called out in the national media for requiring sick notes from its employees. They quickly reversed the policy and announced a $40 million relief fund for their workers. They also offered up to 2 weeks of scheduled pay for hourly workers. These are moves in the right direction, but far short of the comprehensive plan they should have in place, especially as we move through this difficult transition to more inclusive, sustainable, and productive economy post-pandemic. Shareholders, like all of us on this call, have to continue to use our power to make sure we get this kind of an outcome. And that's where we're at.
Thank you very much, Colette, for this. So I think it's interesting to note right here how you are sort of elevating pressure on the company and going from shareholder resolution to like voting against a board member, recommending a vote against a board member. So that sounds like an innovative way, I guess, of placing responsibility on workforce issues on specific board members. So very interesting. We are now going to turn to our third speaker, Emma Pullman. So Emma is Capital Stewardship Officer with the BCG-EU, as I was mentioning earlier, and she will present on some resolutions that they filed in the past and explain how that has resulted in changes in company practices as well. And then we'll have I guess, a bit of information around what they're working on in this upcoming AGM season. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much. So I'm so super happy to be here today on unceded Coast Salish territory in Vancouver. And I really want to thank the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network for putting this on. You know, I think that I've already heard so many important things that I hope that folks on this call take away with them today. I think this is such an important conversation to be having right now. You know, I think during this global pandemic, this is serving as a huge moment to underscore that we have so much work to do in the S of ESG. Workers need us more than ever. I think that many companies are struggling in the face of the global pandemic, and this could be an excuse to delay implementing important protections for workers, and protections that labor has fought hard for could be in danger. And so I think that if you take one thing from this today, it's that I'd love for you to take the lessons that we've learned from Colette and what we've heard from Shannon in terms of the practical steps that you can take with you and get ready. So I've got kind of 3 tips for you today. And so the first tip, which is I'm going to talk about some shareholder resolutions, but getting strong support for shareholder resolutions is really critical. And Colette really underlined this, getting such strong support. But management getting the vote on what vote that we earn really indicates how serious a company takes an issue. And I think it's so important for us to be really looking at the disclosure that companies are offering and really looking to how our funds are voting and what their policies are, because I think that there's a lot of missed opportunities. And so, you know, in my general work, I love to see a shareholder vote that earns about 20% or more of independent shareholders. And that's a really big margin of difference between what Colette's talking about. But that goes to show you just how important even a strong but mighty amount of support from investors can do to push management to take an issue quite seriously. And I'm going to talk about one example. It's not a decent work proposal, but it's an issue that we've seen a complete change in company policy. So last year we filed at a dairy company, Saputo, asking the company to adopt a food waste policy. Its peers had adopted food waste policies and Saputo had not. And we did not make headways in our negotiations with the company. And so we did go to a vote. And ahead of the vote, we did contact proxy holders to vote in favor of our resolution. We received an endorsement from Institutional Shareholder Services, which was very important. And as well, we also contacted the press There was a petition that had about 40,000 signatures on it. And I think that both of those pieces worked really well together, soliciting strong support from proxy advisors, from the folks on this call, and then also really showcasing that there was public appetite for this issue to be taken seriously. In the end, we earned 42% of non-controlled shares. That's a very good vote. At the AGM, the company promised on the floor of the AGM that it would release a food waste policy in the next year. And sure enough, a few months ago, the company did. And the company actually went, a few steps further and released a climate and water policy. And I think that this goes to show that I don't think the company would have done this. It certainly wouldn't if it wouldn't have seen the strong support building for the proposal, the endorsement from key investors, and also public pressure building. And so I think that that is a really simple example of what power that you have. And then I think that there's a couple of resolutions that we've filed. So last year we filed a resolution on sexual misconduct at Brookfield Asset Management, and we earned only 10% of the vote. But we are using that as a long-term strategy, and so we have filed a proposal that builds on our successes last year. And I really hope that we can count on your support for this resolution, but that we are building this into a multi-year strategy to really push the company on ensuring safe workplace practices. And I think I'm going to speak about a resolution that we're actually filing this year, because it's coming up very quickly. And so this is on April 30th. I hope that we can count on your support for a shareholder resolution at Loblaw. So Loblaw, as many of you know, is the largest food retailer in Canada. And so we've asked the company to ensure that human rights risks are being addressed at the board level. We note that Loblaw's global peers have variously either adopted or invoked the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or they have invoked or adopted the 10 principles on the UN Global Compact. And we really want to see Loblaw treat human rights with the same urgency as its global peers. And we have there's I think an investor brief that some of you will see in your inboxes today. You should join the Canadian Capital Stewardship mailing list. But I think that support for this proposal is even more urgent, because we have, when Loblaw printed the proposal, it omitted about 40% of the proposal from the proxy circular. And these paragraphs laid out the critical rationale for the proposal. And so we've been engaging with the company to address this in a number of ways, but their response so far has been disappointing. And so I think that it is more important than ever that we see folks supporting this proposal and ensuring that this can't be kicked down the road. I'm going to quickly talk about a couple of other things, and I think this has been kind of touched on, but my second tip is to start thinking about next year right now. And I think that Shannon really underscored this, some tips about, I guess my second and third blend together, making sure that you have done all your due diligence on this side of things so that you're ready for the next season and heading into this season, and start thinking about next year. I really do hope that we see more shareholder resolutions heading into next year that center workers. This is really our moment. This is a moment that will decide how workers fare on the other side of this crisis. I think that we are going to see attempts to undercut working people in the name of austerity, and how successful that will be really hinges on our diligent monitoring of companies, ensuring that we're supporting resolutions that protect working people, and so ultimately yeah, I think that yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there. But I do think that this is such an important moment for your work, and I'm really excited to work with you and use this important vehicle that we have to advance the rights of working people.
Okay, thank you very much for this, Emma. So we just wrapped up our speaker presentation. So we do invite you, if you have any questions, to send them through the questions box, or you can also raise your hand and use your microphone, and we can hear you live on the webinar. So we do have a few questions that came in. I think Tamara, who is working very, very hard behind the scenes, has answered a few of them. But one that I see is, how does one join the CCSN listserv? What we will do, so we do have a website. If you look for CCSN, Canadian Capital Stewardship Network, in Google, you should find it, and you can register to our mailing list. The other thing that we will do is, in the follow-up to this webinar, we will make sure that you have a hyperlink that you can click on. And maybe this is it's a good segue into this slide here, just taking a few seconds on why this network, why here, why now. Obviously, we did not see like the global pandemic coming and all of these issues coming to the fore around, the value of workers, whether it's in a warehouse, in a grocery store, or in the healthcare sector. So what we really want by bringing together trustees, asset owners, and workers and trade unions is that in too many cases, we are seeing workers' capital actually undermine workers' rights as a result of how the investment chain is structured, as a result of having asset owners delegate voting to asset managers, and asset managers voting against specific resolutions. And as Emma was mentioning, when the voting results on key resolutions are low, this basically legitimates corporate executives to come back to those that filed the resolutions and to say, this is not an issue that investors are concerned about. And we are trying to say otherwise here. So maybe going back to this notion of fiduciary duty, I might have a question for Shannon, but anyone can feel free to jump in. Can you talk about how incorporating ESG aligns with the fiduciary duty of trustees, Shannon, and how that whole literature has evolved over the last 10, 15 years?
Sure. In a very short answer, I will go through that. But I think that it has become quite clear that environmental, social, and governance issues are material. They do matter to how corporations perform, particularly over the long run. We see, I mean, the example that we draw on quite a bit is BP. I mean, we see that a company that is rushing to make their quarterly earnings, cut costs, often those costs are labor costs, so that leads to precarious employment situations, that comes at a price. Those things that are externalized results in the BP Gulf disaster and the destruction of the local economy, the destruction of the ecosystems in the Gulf region, and ultimately and unfortunately the deaths of many workers. And so I think it's fairly widely accepted in the mainstream investment space that these ESG issues do matter. And so it's a responsibility and part of the fiduciary duty of trustees to be considering them in the investment decisions that they make, and also in the stewardship that they are doing. So it's not only in how you're picking your stocks, it's how you're acting as an owner that also matters. And I just want to add to that, we often think of this in the company by company level, and we really need to make sure we're looking at what the systemic impacts of income inequality are, and we're seeing that right now. And so, you know, we are seeing, you know, mainstream financial media talking about, oh, you know, social matters, workers matter, and of course they do, because we are embedded in the real economy. And as investors, we also need to start thinking about our fiduciary duty in the real economy and in terms of future generations. I mean, we really have to understand what our fiduciary duty to those in our pension funds who are 20, 25 years old. Are we treating them equitably in terms of the kinds of economies that we're building for the days that they retire? So I think that's where the conversation around fiduciary duty certainly is now, in really trying to understand the systemic risks and what the responsibilities are of trustees to be addressing that. And you know, my sense is, I'm not a lawyer, but my sense is that that certainly sits very squarely on our capital stewardship work.
Thanks very much, Shannon. So we do have 3 more questions that came in, from what I understand. One question for Emma. I will just let her read and come up with an answer. Another question came in here. Can the CCSN help trustee boards be more active in voting their proxies? So that is certainly what we are hoping to achieve by holding this webinar, providing resources. And we're hoping that this serves to really build a community of practice where, if you are on this webinar, you're a single trustee who's on a board and who wants to raise this, you can know that you can reach out to us, and that you have fellow trustees on other boards that you know, will be trying to drive this across as well, and that you can feel sort of empowered, I guess, to take this to the board and drive some change in the investment chain. I can go, so Tamara is telling me that we have a question that that would be coming through the microphone. So Tamara, do you want to unmute our speaker?
I think I can just read out the question. This is a question for Emma from James Infantino, and he says, my understanding is that BCI manages a large portion of BCGEU members' pension funds. Can you briefly describe how your organization interacts with BCI to move forward the proxy voting agenda?
So when I talk about the BCGEU's capital stewardship work, I'm actually referring to our general and strike fund investments that are that we actively steward and manage, and not about pension funds. And so I can actually not really speak to the pension fund aspect of that, unfortunately.
Can you say a few words, Emma, about the types of funds whose capital is sort of coming together, I guess, to support this work?
Sorry, can you say that again?
So you said it's not pension funds, so it's what kind of funds, I guess, when you're filing resolutions, through which kinds of funds are you doing so?
Yeah, so our 2 segregated fund are actually our member strike dues, is our biggest fund, and so we have built up a very powerful strike fund that, you know, gives our members certainty when going to the bargaining table for a better contract. And actually, since the end of 2016, our members actually haven't paid dues into the strike fund, because at this point it is performing so well as an investment that it is an endowment. And so that also speaks to another aspect of the power of this work. We divested out of fossil fuels and really responsibly steward this investment. And ultimately that means that a lot more people have a lot more certainty when fighting for a better contract.
Yeah, thank you. So my takeaway here.
Sorry,
Yes.
can I just jump in a couple of pieces? The first, I wanted to go back to the last question to just say we can come to your board and give presentations to talk in more depth about your specific situation in terms of how your proxies are voted and how you might take some steps to improve the oversight and your ability to direct those votes. So I just wanted to add that, to reach out CCSN, you know, among the Secretariat at Share and also among the broader CCSN network certainly would be able to help facilitate that and have that conversation. And just going back to the question at James, so BCGU has trustees that do sit on the various trustee boards that use BCI. So that's, you know, because those are jointly trusteed plans, that is where you're also seeing the work of BCGU trustees. So I just add that little bit there.
Great, thank you, Shannon. So I don't see.
No, sorry to interrupt. There is a question from Brian. So I'm just going to unmute Brian Schramm right now. And Brian, you should be able to talk in about 2 seconds. Make that 3 seconds. Okay, there you go.
There it is. Hi. So yeah, Shannon kind of jumped in there with because I work for the BCGM staff, but I also am appointed to the boards. But I can speak on behalf of some of the information that was put around the voting for proxy voting for the plans with BCI, but in my staff role, not as a trustee. But what usually happens is that, like Shannon said, we have trustees. We have parameters set out in the SIP with regards to our beliefs and expectations of BCI. We receive regular reporting on upcoming votes. If there's, they might lay out what the priorities are in terms of what the key issues are coming up in that voting season. We receive a report out on how many votes that they will have voted, and they will highlight some of the more key issues and how those votes went. So the boards work in conjunction with BCI, and we receive regular report outs. And also BCI works very closely with Share. I'm on the call today because I also, in my role as a trustee, I also sit as the chair of the investment committee. So I just, you know, we're doing a lot of work in terms of ESG, and this is one of our fiduciary responsibilities to make sure that we're informed and know what questions to ask. So if that helps, James, that's all.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate that. So we're getting to the top of the hour here, so we are going to wrap up. Just to mention once again some of the upcoming resolutions that will be voted on in the next few months. You can of course reach out to us for more information. Emma mentioned Brookfield Asset Management. There will be some shareholder resolutions filed there. Restaurant Brands International, Tim Hortons, of course. Loblaws, the shareholder resolution that Emma mentioned. Amazon, of course, is one to watch out for. There is a lot of attention being paid to how workers are treated in the company's global operations. The company employs over 840,000 workers, I believe. And there will also be a vote on responsible employment at Couche-Tard in September. So this is the kind of role that we are hoping to kind of play as the CCSN, bring this information to the attention of trustees. And in conclusion, so I would like to just take a second to thank all the speakers for their presentations. I think it was very insightful, and I hope our participants enjoyed your presentations. Very special thank you, of course, to my colleague Tamara Herman, who troubleshooted the webinar and getting the video that everyone was able to enjoy. As mentioned, a link to the webinar will be uploaded to the CCSN website. And as a final reminder, we kindly invite you to register to the CCSN mailing list, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. So thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.